the birth of a restless empire. In the soft hush of the Roman dawn, when the mists curled around the 7 hills like 1,000 translucent serpents, a young Julius Caesar was nothing more than a pale boy with 2 large eyes, drifting between the colonnades of his ancestral home. The year was 85 BCE, and Rome was a restless creature, its limbs forever stretching outward, never satisfied with the borders it had conquered. You can almost picture the worn sandals of merchants scraping the cobbles, the thin cries of hawkers echoing under the porticos, the sweet, acrid scent of olives pressed for oil. It was an age where names were carved onto tablets as easily as they were struck from memory. Caesar's family, though noble, had tasted the bitter dust of decline. The Julians were not the wealthiest of patricians, and there were whispers that they clung to old glories more than any living power. Yet something in the boy's solemn face hinted that their story was not yet over. He was born into a world forever bracing itself for the next war. Beyond the city's boundaries, restless provinces seethed with resentment, and beyond them still, barbarian tribes watched Rome's appetite grow with suspicion. As a child, Caesar must have heard, time and again, the names of places that sounded almost dreamlike. Gaul, Hispania, Parthia, lands where legions marched in neat columns, where governors built aqueducts and temples, where a single senator's decree could alter the lives of 1,000 villages. There is a quiet power in understanding that before the triumphs and assassinations, before the laurel wreaths and the river crossings, there was this, a frail child studying the genealogies of his ancestors by lamplight. Perhaps he wondered if any of it mattered. Perhaps he knew, even then, that empires rise first in the minds of those who dare to imagine them. His early life unfolded like a slow murmur beneath the clamor of Roman politics. He lost his father at 16, a moment that both shattered and liberated him. For in losing the anchor of paternal guidance, he was thrust into a sea of ambition. His mother, Aurelia, was a figure of quiet resolve. She taught him the fine art of appearances, how to smile with precisely the right degree of humility, how to accept praise without ever believing it too fully. Meanwhile, the city itself was changing. The Republic was rotting from within, though few dared to say so aloud. In the Senate House, rival factions traded accusations as easily as coins. Sulla, the ruthless dictator, stalked the streets with his prescriptions, lists of names read out loud, each syllable a sentence of death. It was in these years that Caesar learned the true currency of Roman life: fear. Yet even fear could not keep him from defying Sulla's command to divorce his wife, Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, one of Sulla's bitterest enemies. It was a decision as dangerous as it was stubborn. When Sulla finally relented, it was said he muttered that in Caesar there were many Mariuses, many seeds of rebellion, sprouting beneath the polished surface, and so the boy became a man under the shadow of tyranny. But he did not simply endure, he observed. Every exile, every accusation, every execution, he stored it away like a ledger of grievances. These memories would become the quiet engine of his ambition. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the hush that came over the forum when he returned from hiding. His hair cropped short, his manner calm. He walked through the marble porticos with the careful detachment of one who had glimpsed the edge of power and had not recoiled. There is something mesmerizing about a young man who has learned not merely to survive history, but to shape it. Even in his early military campaigns in Asia Minor, when he was still just another minor magistrate with a borrowed title, Caesar displayed a certain ease with risk. He was captured by pirates, and in that strange captivity, he laughed with them, promising he would crucify them once he was free. And when the ransom was paid, and he was indeed released, he kept his promise, though with the peculiar courtesy of first ordering their throats cut, so their deaths might be swifter. Such are the small details that reveal more than any monument ever could. A man who could jest with his captors and then fulfill a lethal threat without triumph or regret was not destined to remain obscure. He returned to Rome not merely as a survivor, but as a creature reborn, no longer merely an heir of fading nobility, but a force that would eventually test the Republic's every limit. In the evenings of those early years, when the lamps were lit and the city quieted into a sullen hush, perhaps Caesar sometimes imagined a different fate. A quiet life, free of the Senate's intrigues, the endless calculations of power. But some spirits are simply too restive for stillness. In that delicate space between memory and ambition, the outline of empire began to glow. Rome had birthed many conquerors, many orators, many men who believed themselves indispensable. But there was something in Caesar, a subtle conviction, an unhurried certainty, that set him apart. And so, the boy of the 7 hills drifted toward destiny, step by careful step. One day, he would cross the Rubicon and claim all of Rome as his own. But first, he would become a man who could never again be content to watch the story unfold without him at its center. In the hush before that inevitable crossing, the world still believed it might yet escape his ambition. It was a belief that would not survive the next dawn. Shall we drift further into this unfolding story? The march into Gaul. It began without fanfare, without the proclamations that so often preceded Rome's wars of expansion. In 58 BCE, Julius Caesar was appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, a posting that to many seemed little more than a consolation prize for a man who had always aimed higher. But power, like water, seeps into whatever cracks it can find. And in the quiet valleys beyond the Alps, Caesar saw the outline of a new destiny taking shape. Picture him at dawn, standing in the pale blue chill of a Gallic morning, his cloak drawn close, the breath of his soldiers rising in white puffs against the sky. Before them stretched a land of dense forests and restless tribes, a place Romans still thought of as half-civilized, if civilized at all. Yet to Caesar, it shimmered with opportunity. Gaul was not a single nation, but a patchwork of rival peoples. The Helvetii with their slow migrations, the Belgae with their fierce independence, the Aedui with their uneasy alliances. Each tribe possessed its own customs, its own proud history, its own grudges. Caesar understood instinctively that if Rome could not defeat them outright, it might coax them into destroying one another. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Senate watched with a wary curiosity. They had granted Caesar authority, but few believed he could transform this cold frontier into the theater of his legend. And so, as the year unfolded, he began to test the boundaries of what his command could accomplish. The first campaign came almost as an afterthought. The Helvetii had grown weary of their narrow lands in what is now Switzerland. They packed their lives into great wagon trains, families, cattle, household gods, and began to drift westward, intending to settle near the Atlantic. To the Senate, this was a distant curiosity, a problem for others to solve. But to Caesar, it was the perfect pretext for intervention. He intercepted them near the Rhone. There, beneath the wide sky, he demanded they return to their homeland. When they refused, he built a wall, an earthwork nearly 20 miles long, a monument to Roman determination and his own quiet ferocity. He harried them until they broke apart in confusion, their migration dissolving into ruin. By autumn, they had surrendered, and Caesar had secured his first triumph on Gallic soil. In the telling of it, this may sound inevitable, as if the tribes never had a chance. But if you could step back into those months, you would see 1,000 small uncertainties. There were nights when Roman scouts returned with grim faces, when the tribes nearly outmaneuvered the legions, when victory depended on a single messenger reaching a distant outpost in time. History is a tapestry woven from such moments, fragile, contingent, never truly foregone. By the time the Senate received word of the Helvetii's defeat, Caesar was already thinking beyond the horizon. The Belgae, unsettled by Rome's aggression, were gathering their own strength. It would have been easy, reasonable, to consolidate his hold and rest his troops. But Caesar was not a man content with consolidation. He understood something essential about momentum, that once it began, it must be fed, or it would die. The campaign against the Belgae was brutal, conducted through sodden fields and half-frozen rivers. The tribes struck with sudden ferocity, slipping back into the forests before Roman formations could close. Again and again, Caesar forced his men onward, building fortifications, burning villages, breaking alliances. He described these campaigns with the same detached clarity he brought to all things, as if war were nothing more than a sequence of problems to be solved. Perhaps that was part of his power, the refusal to indulge in either cruelty or sentimentality. For him, conquest was not a theater of glory, but an extension of politics by other means, and in those damp woods and empty fields, he found a rhythm he would never abandon, a relentless march, a quiet certainty that the world could be shaped to his will. At times, you might imagine he stood alone in his tent at night, listening to the rain tapping against the canvas, wondering whether Rome would ever truly understand what he was becoming. He was no longer merely the ambitious politician who had defied Sulla and charmed the Forum. Here, far from the marble colonnades, he was transforming himself into something harder, something unanswerable. By the end of that year, most of northern Gaul lay under Roman control, not through a single decisive victory, but by an accumulation of smaller ones, skirmishes, alliances, betrayals. Caesar wrote dispatches home, careful to shape the story as he wished it to be remembered. He knew how memory worked, how easily it could be guided, how quickly it could forget the chaos behind a polished triumph. The Senate, reading his reports by lamplight, began to feel a flicker of unease. Each success increased his power, and theirs diminished by the same measure. But it was too late to recall him. The machine he had set in motion was already devouring Gaul, inch by steady inch. Some evenings, as the legions pitched camp in a new valley, Caesar would walk among the soldiers. They had come to trust him, not because he shared their hardships, though he did, but because he never allowed uncertainty to show. Even in defeat, he gave the impression of a man following a plan no one else could see. Perhaps that was his most dangerous quality, the calm conviction that no setback was final, that every reversal was merely another turn in a story that would end as he desired. And so, as the winter winds crept down from the mountains, the tribes retreated into uneasy truces, and Rome began to sense that Gaul, so long the land of restless tribes and unbroken resistance, was slipping beyond any hope of reclaiming its independence. But for Caesar, this was only the beginning. He understood that power, once tasted, demands ever greater conquests to sustain it. Would you like to follow the next step of this quiet, unstoppable advance? The siege of Alesia. If there is a moment when the conquest of Gaul seems to crystallize, when it sheds all pretense of negotiation and becomes a simple question of endurance, it is the siege of Alesia. You can imagine it in the early autumn light of 52 BCE, when the hills were brushed in fading green, and the mornings arrived cold enough to draw steam from every soldier's breath. Alesia itself, was a fortified settlement perched on a high plateau, ringed by steep slopes that gave the Gauls every advantage of defense. To look upon it was to understand why so many believed this siege would break Caesar at last. Inside the walls waited Vercingetorix, the chieftain who had gathered the scattered tribes into a single coalition, a leader whose charisma and vision had come closer than any before him to stopping Rome's relentless expansion. It is easy, from this distance, to see the siege as inevitable, another link in the long chain of Roman victories. But in those first days, nothing felt inevitable. The Gallic cavalry ranged freely across the valleys, striking the Roman foragers, burning their supply lines. The defenders believed time was their ally, that hunger and cold would weaken the legions far more than any spear. Yet Caesar, standing in the long grass below the walls, did not retreat. Instead, he began to build. First came a line of trenches and ramparts encircling Alesia itself, so no escape was possible. The Romans called this the circumvallation. Day after day, teams of laborers dug and hauled timber, constructing palisades and watchtowers in an unbroken ring. From a distance, it must have looked like a second city rising to challenge the first, a silent declaration that Rome would not be dislodged. But Caesar was not content with one wall. He anticipated that a relief army would come to lift the siege, and so he ordered a second fortification facing outward, the Contravallation, enclosing the Romans within their own defenses. A double circle of earthworks, nearly 12 miles in circumference, all raised under the threat of constant attack. In the damp evenings, when the fires glowed along the ramparts, and the night was split by the cries of sentries, you might have sensed the strangeness of it all. Two armies, one trapped, one surrounding them, both knowing that salvation or ruin hung on a single test of will. Inside Alesia, food began to dwindle. Vercingetorix made the bitter decision to send out the non-combatants, women, children, the old, hoping the Romans would let them pass. But Caesar refused. He would not feed those who could no longer fight. And so, for days, these refugees lingered in the ditch between the walls and the city gates, their suffering visible to both sides. It is a detail that lingers in the mind because it shows how the siege stripped away every illusion of mercy. Meanwhile, the relief force did come. Tens of thousands of Gallic warriors advanced across the plains, their standards bright against the autumn sky. From the walls, the defenders cheered, believing the moment of deliverance had come. And in those first assaults, when the Romans were pressed hard on both sides of their fortifications, when the shouts and the clatter of weapons rolled across the fields without pause, it must have seemed possible, just possible, that Caesar would finally be forced to withdraw. But he did not. He moved from rampart to rampart, appearing wherever the danger was greatest. His calm was not an act. It was a condition of his being. To panic, even in the face of collapse, was to admit that events could not be shaped by resolve. And so, by nightfall, the Roman lines still held. The next day brought renewed attacks. Gallic warriors drove ladders against the walls, filled the trenches with earth and timber, poured over the outer ramparts in surging waves. The Roman defenders were exhausted, battered, hungry. Still, Caesar would not yield an inch. At dawn on the final day of the great assault, the Gallic relief force launched an all-out attack on a weak point in the northern perimeter. As Roman lines buckled, Caesar ordered his cavalry, held in reserve for this decisive moment, to ride out behind the attackers and strike them from the rear. In the confusion, the relief army broke. Some tried to flee into the hills, others fell where they stood. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix understood at last that no rescue would come. He gathered his council, spoke a few final words, and rode out to surrender. He offered his weapons and himself as the price of sparing his people further bloodshed. It was a gesture both noble and futile, because Rome's victory was already complete. For Caesar, the surrender was more than the end of a campaign. It was the culmination of years of unbroken advance, the moment when Gaul ceased to be a wild frontier and became, irrevocably, part of Rome's dominion. In the quiet that followed, the Romans dismantled their double walls, burned the timber fortifications, buried their dead. The survivors of Alesia were sold into slavery or forced to submit as client tribes. The land that had once defied the legions now lay open, subdued by discipline as much as by force. If you walked those fields in the weeks after the siege, you would have seen only the wind brushing through trampled grass and the black scars where fires had burned. To look at it, you might never guess how much ambition and suffering had been spent to make it Roman. And yet, beneath that silence, a deeper truth remained. Caesar had shown that no obstacle, neither hunger nor desperation, nor the courage of a united people, could stand before the quiet certainty of his will. Perhaps you wonder what dreams visited him in the nights after Alesia fell. Whether he saw in the darkness not only the outline of victory, but the first shadows of the fate that would one day find him in Rome. Would you like to follow where those shadows led? Aftermath and consolidation. When the fires of Alesia finally smoldered into ash, the land itself seemed to exhale, a long, exhausted breath released after months of siege and struggle. But in truth, no peace had yet arrived. What lingered in the Gallic countryside was not quiet acceptance, but a sullen, heavy resignation, as if every village and farmstead understood that something final had been decided. Caesar did not hurry to leave the region. He moved deliberately from one stronghold to the next, accepting hostages, overseeing the dismantling of fortifications, and imposing the new arrangements that would bind Gaul to Roman rule. To the Gallic chieftains who had once dared to dream of independence, he offered a simple bargain: obedience in exchange for survival. Each town that submitted was left standing, though stripped of weapons and tribute. Each tribe that hesitated was reminded with measured force that Rome no longer negotiated. Over time, the rhythm of conquest slowed, becoming a procession of formal surrenders rather than pitched battles. In this slow, inevitable manner, the last sparks of coordinated resistance flickered out. It is said that when Vercingetorix was paraded through the Roman camp as a prisoner, there was no jeering from the legionaries. Perhaps they understood, in some unspoken way, that he embodied the best of what they had been sent to destroy. A leader who had nearly turned all Gaul into a single will, as determined as their own. But respect did not spare him the fate reserved for defeated enemies. He would be held in chains for years, saved for a final spectacle in Rome. While the prisoners were sorted and the spoils counted, Caesar sat beneath his campaign tent, its canvas fluttering in the autumn wind, and wrote dispatches to the Senate. In them, he described the siege in careful, precise terms, recording his victories as if they were the result of a natural progression rather than a precarious gamble. There is something almost hypnotic in his reports, the way they recite each maneuver with the same calm detachment, a tone that makes every conquest seem preordained. And yet, among his staff, there were some who sensed that this triumph carried the seeds of new conflict. With Gaul subdued, Caesar's prestige had swollen beyond anything the Senate had anticipated. His soldiers were no longer merely loyal. They were bound to him by years of hardship and the promise of further rewards. Every legionary who had endured the trenches of Alesia would remember who had led them there and who had delivered them victory. At night, the Roman camp settled into the hush of routine. The watchfires glowed on the ridgelines. The sentries paced their rounds in solemn silence. But beyond the palisade, across the wide darkness of the plains, the conquered villages lay in uneasy sleep. For the Gauls, this new reality was still raw, a wound that had yet to scar over. You might imagine a family huddled in a timber longhouse, the father staring into the embers while his children dozed. Perhaps he still nursed the faint hope that someday the tribes would rise again, that someday Roman arrogance would meet its reckoning. But he would have known, too, that hope alone had never been enough to hold back the legions. Meanwhile, Caesar began the work of transforming victory into permanence. Roads were surveyed, garrisons established, taxes assessed. Grain and livestock flowed south into Roman depots. In return, merchants carried amphorae of wine and olive oil up the same roads that had once resounded with marching feet. What had been an enemy frontier only months before was now a network of trade and tribute, proof that Rome's appetite could be sated only by complete assimilation. For the veterans of the conquest, settlement was both a reward and a method of control. Caesar promised land grants to those prepared to remain in Gaul as colonists, ceding Roman customs and language among the subdued tribes. New towns were laid out in the familiar grid of Roman urban life, forums, baths, and temples rising from ground that had been sown with blood. Some Gauls adopted Roman dress, Roman law, Roman ways of thinking. Others retreated into the hills, where their old gods and old stories could still be spoken aloud, unobserved by Roman officials. Over time, these fragments of identity would persist, but always beneath the surface, like roots buried under a paved road. Even in his own mind, Caesar must have recognized that subjugation did not erase memory. He was too skilled an observer to imagine that victory alone could dissolve the fierce pride that had united the tribes. But in the calculus of empire, resentment was acceptable, so long as it never again found the means to organize itself. When winter finally settled over Gaul, it brought a hush more profound than any army could impose. Snow drifted into the abandoned trenches, softening the scars of siege. The roads grew empty as the campaigning season ended. In Rome, the Senate received Caesar's reports and debated how much power one man should be allowed to hold. In the camps, soldiers repaired their equipment and dreamed of the triumphal procession that awaited them at home. But Gaul itself lay under a blanket of quiet, its people left to reckon with a future they had not chosen. If you stood there on a winter morning, with the frost glinting on the fields and the air so cold it stole your breath, you would have seen no banners, no columns of soldiers, no visible sign of the great convulsion that had remade their world. Only the silence of a land learning how to live beneath a foreign standard. And perhaps you would have wondered whether this was truly the end of the story, or merely the beginning of something deeper, more patient, that would one day rise again. Shall we follow where that question leads? The long winter within the walls. It was in the dimming light of October that the vast encirclement settled into a strained, unbroken stillness. The Roman fortifications stretched in two colossal rings, one facing outward against the gathering Gaulish relief armies, the other turned inward toward the packed thousands within Alicia's walls. As the first frost crept over the palisades and the trenches hardened in the cold, the siege began to reveal its more patient, more punishing face. Caesar's soldiers had learned to endure discomfort without complaint. They huddled beneath coarse woolen cloaks, dug their trenches deeper to escape the wind, and took their meals of barley porridge in quiet ranks. There was no flamboyant rhetoric, no nightly revels, only the monotony of vigilance, the soft scrape of shovels against frozen earth, the muted shuffle of sentries relieving one another in the darkness. Within Alicia, however, the season's turn was something close to despair. Vercingetorix, once the defiant prince on horseback, was now a man forced into careful calculation with each diminishing sack of grain. He gathered his chiefs and elders in the smoky chambers at the heart of the fortress and laid out the arithmetic no warrior wished to hear. They had rationed everything to the threshold of starvation. Children cried through the night, their bellies shrunk against their ribs. Horses, once the pride of noble warriors, were slaughtered in makeshift pens, their meat eked out in thin, flavorless stews. Each day, fewer torches burned along the ramparts. Each morning, more bodies were carried out and piled against the earthen wall, so many that by November, the stench was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, in the Roman camps, the winter brought different trials. The men fought sickness as much as any enemy. Pneumonia and fever spread among those who slept too long in damp boots. The medics, barely more than old veterans, who had learned the arts of poultice and cautery, moved from tent to tent, daubing wounds and mixing bitter draughts. Still, the Romans clung to an unspoken conviction that Caesar would never allow them to suffer idly. He moved constantly along the lines, his cloak crusted with frost, exchanging brief words with centurions, commending a trench's depth here, a watchtower's repairs there. His presence was like a banked fire that never went out. Even in the gloomiest dawns, when snow crept across the parapets and wind hissed through the sharpened stakes, the legionaries drew a quiet strength from the certainty that they were part of something greater than themselves. The relief armies did not vanish into the cold. Scouts returned to Vercingetorix, whispering of growing numbers gathering in the forests, warriors from nearly every tribe who had sworn that the siege would not outlast the winter. Sometimes at night, those on the Roman palisades would see hundreds of campfires glimmering in the distant dark like the eyes of a watchful beast. The prospect of a final battle was no longer a question of if, but of when. Still, time itself was Caesar's ally. Every week that passed drained Alesia of hope and resources. Every day that food was withheld made the Gaulish coalition outside more restless, more fractious. Among the defenders, there were moments when hope flickered. A sudden snowfall seemed to promise that the Romans too would be forced to abandon their siege, unable to feed their thousands or keep them from disease. Yet each dawn, the Roman standards still bristled above their ramparts. Each night, the torches glowed in the same patient rows. Winter did not break the Romans. It only tested their endurance like a whetstone drawn slowly across iron. In the longest nights of December, Vercingetorix called a council that lasted until dawn. Some urged him to attempt a breakout in the snow, to gamble every last strength on a desperate assault. Others insisted the relief armies would come if only they could hold out a little longer. But no decision could be made without risking ruin. So the chieftains returned to their quarters in sullen silence. In the fortress streets, no one dared ask how much grain remained in the storerooms. They all understood that the measure of their days was counted in handfuls. When the first day of the new year came, it arrived without ceremony. Snow drifted along the Roman embankments. The sentries changed their watch with the same practiced efficiency. Inside Alesia, the people awoke to hunger that had become so constant, it no longer felt like suffering, but simply the way life must be. In those quiet hours, both sides waited for the thaw, for the clash they knew would decide not only the siege, but the destiny of Gaul itself. And while the frost clung stubbornly to every rampart and every corpse, the thought began to grow in many hearts. That winter would not be the thing that finally decided their fate. Would the relief come in time, or would the final breath of Alesia be drawn in the cold, the promise of salvation beyond the horizon? As the siege reached its deepest frost, the rumor of salvation became almost a presence in the air, a hush that moved through the defenders' cramped shelters and wound its way around the fires of the Roman sentries. From the south and the west, the Gaulish relief forces were said to be gathering into an army so vast it would blot out the slopes when it came. Messengers slipped past the Roman works under moonless skies, breathless with urgency, repeating the promise that thousands upon thousands were marching to lift the siege. Each night, the whisper grew. Help was coming. Help was coming soon. Within Alesia, these words were clutched like a talisman against despair. The old men who remembered earlier wars tried to measure out the days by the stores of grain and the count of the horses still alive. The warriors paced the narrow lanes between huts, unable to look one another fully in the eye, for fear their doubt would show. Vercingetorix himself had begun to look like a figure carved of oak, hollow-eyed, motionless, except for the faint nods he gave when reports arrived. Each dawn, he walked along the ramparts, his fur cloak trailing behind him, peering past the Roman lines toward the distant hills. Perhaps he believed that if he stared long enough, he might see the dust of approaching horsemen rising against the sky. Meanwhile, Caesar's scouts roamed the forests for miles, capturing or killing any courier they could. Yet even their vigilance could not smother every whisper. One afternoon, a Gallic prisoner was dragged before the Roman command, his hands bound and face streaked with dirt. He spoke of a coalition of nearly 250,000 men, warriors from the Arverni, the Aedui, the Carnutes, and dozens more. They would come in one unstoppable wave to break the double line of fortifications. Some of Caesar's officers, hardened by years of campaigns, felt their stomachs tighten. Even for Rome, such a number could not be ignored. But Caesar received the news with a peculiar calm. He ordered the prisoner removed and convened his legates in the largest tent, its walls rippling with the wind. There, he laid out the plan in the same measured voice he had used to explain the invasion of Britain, the crossing of the Rubicon, and the seizure of all Gaul. The legions would hold their ground, no matter the odds. Every trench, every rampart, every wooden tower would be reinforced. Supplies would be rationed more strictly than ever before. And above all, no thought would be given to retreat. It was not a choice the Roman army knew how to make. So as January melted slowly into February, both sides prepared for the final struggle. One with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose, the other with the disciplined certainty that the gods favored those who endured. In the darkness beyond the Roman earthworks, the Gaulish relief armies were indeed gathering. Each tribe sent their finest warriors, their most storied champions, eager to prove that the humiliation of surrender could be erased in a single, overwhelming blow. They came on foot and on horseback, with carts full of weapons and provisions, determined to surround Caesar as he had surrounded their kin. Inside Alesia, the coming of this army became an article of faith. Children too weak to stand listened to their mothers murmur stories of the deliverance that would soon arrive. Even the most pragmatic elders began to measure time in terms of how long it would take the relief force to reach them. And Vercingetorix, though he never said it aloud, began to believe that all his defiance might yet be rewarded. Among the Romans, there was no such hope, only the cold clarity of calculation. They dug fresh pits along the outer ramparts, lining them with sharpened stakes hidden beneath loose brush. They raised additional towers, positioned in such a way that no approach would be free of arrow fire. They built caltrops, cruel iron stars designed to cripple charging horses, and scattered them in the frozen grass. Each night, the legionaries gathered in their tents, sharpening swords, oiling the hinges of shields, and telling themselves that no foe had yet managed to breach a Roman line when Caesar commanded it. Yet in the stillness before dawn, even the bravest men sometimes felt a quiet dread. They knew the siege was entering its final movement, that the coming weeks would either elevate them to legends or consign them to anonymous graves beneath Gallic earth. And so, with every hour, the hush of anticipation thickened. When sentries looked out across the empty fields, they thought they could almost feel the presence of thousands just beyond sight, waiting for the first horn to sound. Would the arrival of this vast host shatter the Roman discipline? Or would Alicia's last hope vanish like the mist at sunrise? No one could say. All that remained was the unbroken watch and the certainty that the end, one way or another, was approaching. The first sight of the relief army, it began, not with a roar or a sudden clash, but with a line of wavering shapes on the horizon, too far to make out, but too many to be mistaken for anything but an army. The watchers on Caesar's outer ramparts were the first to glimpse them, countless specks slowly resolving into men, horses, wagons, banners. In the frost-blurred dawn, it was almost as if the hills themselves had begun to move, swelling with life. A messenger was dispatched at once to the central encampment, and by the time he reached Caesar's command tent, the word had already spread along the earthworks. They were here, from within Alicia. The Gauls emerged onto their battered walls, staring in stunned relief. Some dropped to their knees. Others began to shout the names of tribes they recognized by the standards flapping in the wind, the tall iron poles crowned by animal totems, the woven emblems glinting with dew. For weeks they had lived on the brink of starvation, their bodies thinned by hunger and fear. And now, at last, the promise had materialized. The promise had faces, weapons, voices. It was no longer a story whispered in the dark. For the Romans, the moment carried a different weight. The legions had drilled for this hour, prepared in silent, relentless fashion. But no exercise had truly captured what it felt like to behold an enemy force so numerous that the land itself seemed unable to contain it. Veterans of the Gallic campaigns, men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Caesar from the earliest conquests, exchanged glances that admitted what their discipline forbade them to say aloud. The odds had shifted. No legion, no matter how iron-willed, could gaze upon such numbers without a flicker of doubt. Caesar himself did not falter. He rode along the perimeter on a white horse, the animal's breath misting in the cold, stopping every few paces to address a centurion or a cohort commander. His voice remained low and precise, never rising above the hush that had settled over the fortifications. Observers would later say that he looked almost serene, as though he had anticipated this precise spectacle in a dream, and was now simply living its fulfillment. Meanwhile, the relief army continued to assemble. The slopes filled with detachments, Aedui, Arverni, Sequani, Belgae, and more, each group establishing its own camp, erecting palisades, and lighting cooking fires that glittered like a swarm of distant stars. Drums and horns sounded in overlapping waves as officers tried to impose order on the sea of warriors. Some detachments, eager to demonstrate their courage, advanced closer to the Roman line, only to be called back by more cautious chieftains. It was not yet time to strike. The Gaulish leaders conferred in clusters, debating how best to break the encirclement without exposing themselves to the disciplined counterattacks that had shattered them in so many previous battles. Inside Alesia, the beleaguered defenders waited for a signal, some flare or trumpet call to announce that the siege was ending. But the day stretched on with no assault. As the pale afternoon light began to fade, it became clear that the relief force was not rushing headlong into combat. They were taking their time, gathering strength, observing the Roman defenses with meticulous patience. For Vercingetorix, it was a difficult truth to accept. that even when rescue had arrived, survival was not yet guaranteed. As night descended, the contrast between the two encampments became stark. In the Roman lines, fires burned in tight, disciplined rings, each flame marking the center of a cohort's watch. Every soldier knew his post, his signal, his orders. They spoke little, conserving energy for the ordeal to come. Across the fields, the Gaulish army's fires sprawled in great irregular constellations. The air carried the sounds of thousands of voices, arguments, boasts, the clatter of cauldrons and armor. There was a fierce confidence in that noise, the conviction that sheer numbers must prevail. Yet even among the Gauls, unease sometimes rippled through the ranks. Older warriors remembered the countless times Roman discipline had undone Gallic bravery. They knew that no people had suffered so many defeats at the hands of Caesar, and that he was a commander who thrived in the crucible of impossible odds. Still, they reassured themselves with the magnitude of their host. How could any army withstand so many tribes united in common cause? Before dawn, the first skirmishes flared along the outer trenches. Gaulish cavalry rode in swift circles, probing for weak points, loosing javelins over the ramparts. Roman archers answered in disciplined volleys, driving them back with methodical precision. No ground was gained, but the message was unmistakable. The siege had entered its final phase, and so the men of both nations lay awake in their camps, listening to the restless murmurs of thousands around them. The siege of Alesia had become something more than a battle. It was an ordeal of endurance, of patience as much as of strength. When dawn returned, it would bring a test that neither side could escape. And as the first light crept over the hills, every watcher knew that the waiting was almost over, the beginning of the assault. At the break of dawn, when the mist still clung to the grass and the dew glittered along the Roman palisades, the quiet dissolved in an abrupt crescendo of horns. From the vast Gaulish encampment beyond the outer trenches, the signal had come at last. It began with the movement of skirmishers, bands of light infantry advancing in loose order to harry the Roman outworks. Behind them, the massed infantry readied their shields and lances, tightening their ranks as chieftains rode along the front, calling out encouragement that merged into a single, indistinct roar. The Roman soldiers, long braced for this day, climbed to their stations. Some had slept fully armed, the cold night pressing through their cloaks. The engineers rushed to the forward positions, checking the tripwires and hidden pits that formed the first ring of defense. On Caesar's orders, every rampart had been layered with traps. Sharpened stakes sunk into concealed trenches, iron caltrops scattered on approach lanes, ditches so deep they could swallow a charging horse. Then, as the first skirmishers closed the distance, the waiting Romans released their arrows and pila in steady waves. The air filled with the dull thud of missiles striking wood and flesh. Men tumbled forward, entangled in hidden snares, their cries muffled by the dense fog that drifted between the lines. Yet the Gaulish advance did not halt. From every direction, warriors pressed in, pouring into the dead ground before the main ramparts. Trumpets blared again, this time from within Alesia itself, as Vercingetorix ordered a coordinated sally to coincide with the outer assault. Inside the walls, the starving defenders surged from their battered gates in a desperate charge. Their gaunt faces, hollowed by hunger, revealed the terrible gamble they were now committed to: break the siege or perish. For a moment, the Romans were caught between hammer and anvil. Along the inner walls, the legionaries wheeled to meet the sortie, shouting to one another over the chaos. Stones and spears fell in a relentless cascade from the parapets as the Gauls sought to split the defenders' attention. Caesar had expected this dual assault, Riding along the central rampart, he issued a series of short commands to his aides, dispatching reserves where the fighting grew thickest. Decades of campaigns had taught him to recognize the pattern of panic before it could take hold. He knew that discipline, not ferocity, would decide the day. His calm presence moving among the embattled cohorts became a kind of anchor around which the Roman line coalesced. Meanwhile, the relief army hurled itself at the outer fortifications with mounting fury. Siege towers rolled forward, dragged by teams of oxen and shouting warriors. Ladders appeared all along the perimeter, borne on the shoulders of men who seemed oblivious to the volleys cutting them down. At one point, a wedge of Gaulish infantry breached the outer trench and gained a foothold against the palisade itself, driving their iron-tipped stakes into the earth for leverage. But before they could widen the breach, Roman centurions rallied a counterattack. The legionaries charged in dense formation, shields locked, driving the attackers back with disciplined thrusts. For hours, the battle ebbed and flowed. Along the entire circumference of Caesar's fortifications, the air became a haze of dust and screams, and the dull percussion of weapons on wood. Horses stumbled into pits and vanished with a final, strangled cry. Warriors floundered in concealed ditches, trampled by their own comrades. Roman engineers darted among the defenders to repair damaged sections of the wall, their hands slick with blood and earth. Inside Alesia, the Gaulish defenders made progress in the first hour, capturing a forward Roman outpost and forcing the legionaries to withdraw to the second line of ramparts. But the advance could not be sustained. Lacking the weight of numbers that pressed from the outer siege, Vercingetorix's men found themselves repelled again and again by disciplined volleys of pila and arrows. Each failed charge drained their fragile strength further. Hunger was no longer an enemy waiting in the dark. It had entered their limbs, hollowing them from within. By midday, the dual assault settled into a grinding stalemate. The relief force, exhausted by repeated charges, fell back to regroup beyond javelin range. From the Roman parapets, the legionaries watched as the Gaulish chieftains convened amid the churned mud, their gestures animated, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. There would be another attack. Everyone knew it. But for the moment, a heavy quiet descended over the fields, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the rasp of labored breathing. When Caesar rode once more along the inner rampart, he did not need to shout. He spoke quietly to the officers, reminding them that this was the hour all their discipline had been for. He reminded them, too, that the relief army was fighting not only the Romans, but the weight of its own desperation. Hunger was an ally the Gauls could not defeat by force alone. As evening approached, the sky turned a dull, bruised purple, and the first flares ignited among the Gaulish lines, signaling preparations for renewed assault. The Romans watched in weary silence, their bodies aching from the strain of holding every breach. They knew the night would bring no rest, only fresh waves of fury, crashing again and again upon the earthworks. And as darkness fell, the men of both sides felt the same thought settle over them, that the siege had become a trial of endurance more than any test of arms. Tomorrow might bring the final onslaught, or tomorrow might bring nothing at all, save the same unending hunger, the same gnawing uncertainty that hollowed out the spirit more than any blade. The second night assault, when darkness finally swallowed the plains around Alesia, the Roman ramparts became little more than jagged silhouettes against the wavering glow of torches. The men who stood guard along the walls felt their fatigue pressing down with an almost physical weight, their limbs heavy and slow. For a time, the fields were quiet, as if even the Gauls had succumbed to the exhaustion that had seeped into every corner of the siege. But then, without warning, the horns sounded again. The second assault began not with a rush of men, but with the sudden appearance of fire. From dozens of positions along the outer trenches, the Gaulish warriors hurled burning bundles of reeds and pitch. The night came alive in flickering arcs of flame. The first missile struck the palisades, bursting into sheets of fire that danced along the dry timber. Smoke billowed upward, carrying the tang of scorched resin. In that moment, the Roman ramparts, so solid in daylight, seemed fragile, exposed to destruction as surely as any wall of mud. Yet the legionaries did not break formation. Buckets of water, prepared in anticipation, were passed along the lines by men whose faces glistened with sweat and soot. When a section of the wall erupted in flames, teams of engineers swarmed over it, smothering the fire with wet hides and earth. All the while, the archers and slingers maintained a steady rhythm, loosing missiles into the darkness to slow the approach of the Gaulish infantry. From the Roman perspective, the world had shrunk to a narrow band of torchlight. The rest was an unknowable void, from which shouts and war cries rose like the roar of some invisible sea. The defenders could not see the enemy ranks advancing up the slopes, only the wavering points of torchlight growing nearer, bobbing in time with hundreds of footfalls. And then the first ladders materialized out of the gloom, dumping against the palisades. This assault had been planned with ruthless calculation. Rather than strike along the entire circumference, the Gaulish commanders had chosen a single stretch of fortification to overwhelm by sheer numbers. It was a sector held by the 9th Legion, weary after a full day of fighting. As the ladders went up, a torrent of javelins came with them, and Roman shields lifted to catch the deadly rain. In the torchlight, the legionaries glimpsed the painted faces of their assailants, their eyes wide with hunger and determination. At first, the 9th held firm, but as the minutes crawled past, the pressure mounted beyond anything they had endured. More ladders were raised. Siege hooks caught the edges of the palisade, wrenching timbers apart. The Gauls surged upward, clawing over the rampart with wild, desperate energy. For a heartbeat, it seemed the wall would buckle under the weight of so many attackers. Caesar, ever watchful, had been moving among the reserves when word came of the breach. Without hesitation, he ordered the 13th Legion forward. The tired soldiers of the 9th, emboldened by the sight of fresh comrades, tightened their ranks and braced for impact. Together, the two legions met the Gaulish assault at the moment of crisis. The fighting at the parapet was close and brutal. Men grappled across the sharpened stakes, stabbing over the top of shields, pulling each other bodily into the trench below. Arrows hissed overhead, their flight illuminated in brief arcs by the torchlight. There was no room to maneuver. Victory or death came down to the strength of an arm, the angle of a thrust, the chance of a foot finding solid purchase. At the foot of the rampart, the Gauls continued to press forward. Their chieftains shouted encouragement, their voices raw from the long day. From the Roman lines came only the low, wordless roar of men laboring to hold the wall. In those hours, time seemed to lose its shape. Each moment stretched into the next in an unbroken tide of exertion and dread. Gradually, so gradually it was hardly noticed, the momentum shifted. The initial fury of the assault began to wane. Too many Gauls had fallen beneath the walls, or tumbled back into the darkness with mortal wounds. Each fresh wave had to clamber over the bodies of the dead. Roman counterattacks became more frequent, more confident. Engineers seized brief openings to hack down ladders with axes. Archers found clear lines of fire as the Gaulish ranks thinned. When the last ladder was finally torn away and hurled back into the darkness, a deep stillness settled over the breached sector. The only sounds were the labored breaths of the survivors and the crackle of dying fires. In that hush, the Romans did not cheer. They simply stood in place, too spent to feel triumph, aware that dawn would bring yet another test of their endurance. Elsewhere along the ramparts, the assaults had been less intense. Probing attacks meant to tie down reserves, to keep the Romans guessing where the true blow would fall. But everywhere, the night left its mark. By the time the first gray light edged over the horizon, the fields around Alesia were strewn with the fallen, their weapons half buried in churned earth. And among those who still stood, on both sides, there was no certainty about what the coming day would bring. Only the knowledge that the siege was not over. Not yet. And that for every man alive in that cold dawn, the struggle was slowly becoming less about victory and more about survival itself. The quiet before dawn, when the fires finally guttered out along the ramparts, a deeper darkness reclaimed the fields around Alesia. The torches that had burned so brightly during the night assaults had left behind charred posts and drifting plumes of smoke that mingled with the first pale glimmers of dawn. For a little while, there were no shouts, no horns, no clatter of shields against timber. Instead, an uncanny hush spread across the plain. To the exhausted Roman sentries, that silence was almost more unsettling than the din of battle. They stood with their shields resting against their thighs, their eyes stinging from smoke and sleeplessness, straining to pick out any movement in the half-light. Even the crows, drawn by the promise of carrion, waited at a cautious distance, perched in silent rows along the bare branches beyond the earthworks. It was during this lull that Caesar walked the perimeter once more. His cloak was heavy with dew, and his face, usually animated even in crisis, had settled into an expression of profound fatigue. And yet the men who glimpsed him passing along the rampart felt their own exhaustion lift, if only slightly. He did not need to speak. His presence alone, unbowed by the night's ordeal, was enough to remind them of the stakes. Below the walls, the Gaulish camps were no less subdued. In the deeper trenches, warriors dozed in uneasy clumps, their backs propped against battered shields. Many had discarded their helmets and breastplates, too weary to care about vulnerability. The wounded lay in shallow pits, hastily dug to protect them from stray arrows, their moans muffled by cloth packed into bleeding wounds. For Vercingetorix and his commanders, the quiet was a bitter interlude. They had thrown thousands of men against the Roman fortifications, burning precious stores of pitch and timber, testing every weak point in Caesar's encirclement. Yet when the darkness lifted, the ramparts still stood. The inner ring still held the town under siege, and the outer ring still faced the plains, where fresh reinforcements might arrive or might never come. For within Alesia itself, the mood had shifted from hope to desperation. From the ramparts overlooking the Roman inner wall, Gallic fighters could see the torches burning all night beyond the trenches. They knew that their countrymen were fighting and dying in the fields below. But no triumphant horn blasts had sounded. No messengers had come racing up the slope to proclaim a breakthrough. Only silence and the gray dawn, and the realization that their relief armies had not yet triumphed. The townspeople too began to succumb to despair. For weeks they had clung to the promise that Vercingetorix's allies would scatter the Romans and lift the siege. But each day brought tighter rations, fouler water, and more funerals. The city had become a prison, ringed by walls they could not breach, and an enemy that refused to be exhausted. At dawn, when the Roman trumpets finally sounded, it was not a call to battle, but a call to rebuild. Legionaries who had stood all night on the palisades now clambered down to repair the damage. Men in soot-blackened tunics hammered fresh stakes into place, packed earth around charred ramparts, and gathered broken shields for salvage. The clinking of hammers and axes was oddly soothing, a reminder that the lines were intact, that order still held. And in that lull, A curious sense of familiarity settled over both armies. They were locked in a grim routine now. The Gauls would assault, the Romans would repel, and the survivors would brace themselves for the next attempt. Each day bled into the next, with the same grinding inevitability. For the men of the legions, dawn was both a reprieve and a promise of fresh trials. They had survived the night, but they knew that their enemies were watching from beyond the fields, waiting for the moment to surge forward again. The lull would end, the horns would blare, and all the toil and terror of the siege would begin anew. No triumphant proclamations were made when the morning sun finally rose. It revealed nothing the Romans had not already seen. The churned mud littered with broken weapons, the bodies that lay where they had fallen, the weary faces of men who had learned that victory here would not come quickly. Yet in that quiet hour before the next assault, there was a strange, subdued resolve. The siege was becoming something more than a contest of tactics. It was turning into a test of endurance, of who could endure hunger, fear, and exhaustion the longest. And deep in the cold trenches, as the crows began to pick at the fallen, both armies prepared to find out. The final breach. By the time the final great assault was prepared, both sides had been hollowed out by attrition. The Gaulish relief army that gathered on the plains was itself battered, reduced by hunger, disease, and a creeping certainty that they were too late. But desperation has a way of creating its own momentum, and in the twilight of hope, the Gallic leaders resolved to throw everything they had into a last, all-consuming attack. It began before dawn, under a moon thin as a sickle. A cold wind passed over the plain, stirring the tall grasses where thousands of warriors crouched, hidden in the dark. Messengers passed among them in near silence, gesturing rather than calling out, because any sound might alert the Roman sentries along the outer rampart. Spears were checked and rechecked, blades touched to whetstones one final time, as if the edge could somehow decide the outcome. Vercingetorix himself had no part in this outer assault. He remained inside Alesia, watching and waiting. From the heights, the watchfires below looked like stars fallen to earth. He must have known that if this attack failed, there would be no further rescue. No more time to outlast Caesar's lines. Only surrender or starvation. At the signal, a sudden flare that arced across the night sky, the Gauls surged out of hiding. The plain erupted in motion, columns of infantry advancing behind wicker screens, cavalry fanning out to harry the Roman flanks, sappers carrying bundles of brush to hurl into the trenches. The legionaries on the ramparts had only moments to rally before the first ranks collided with the stakes. Even by the standards of the siege, this was different. There was no probing, no feints or skirmishing to test the lines. It was simply a tidal wave, meant to smash the fortifications through sheer weight and fury. In places, the Romans were driven back from the palisades, their torches extinguished in the press of bodies. Javelins flew in great arcing volleys, cutting down men indiscriminately. Meanwhile, inside Alesia, Vercingetorix ordered his own garrison to launch a simultaneous assault against the inner rampart. For the first time, the Romans found themselves attacked on every side at once. Horns blared from opposite directions, echoing across the dark fields and the walls, disorienting even the veterans. It was here, in these desperate hours before dawn, that the Roman discipline was tested beyond anything it had endured. Runners carried messages along the ramparts, pleading for reinforcements where the line had bent under the strain. Caesar himself rode along the inner circuit to hearten the defenders, then turned and galloped across the narrow lanes to the outer wall, where the fighting was fiercest. He wore his scarlet cloak, the same garment he had donned so many times in battle. In the darkness, it appeared almost black, but when torches flared, it glowed like a banner of defiance. Wherever the soldiers saw it, their resolve stiffened. They crowded closer to the palisades, bracing shattered sections with their bodies, hurling rocks and stakes into the seething mass below. The Gauls, for their part, fought with a ferocity born of finality. They knew there would be no dawn truce, no chance to withdraw and regroup. Either they broke the Romans here, or Alesia would be left to its fate. Again and again, they clambered over the ramparts, only to be dragged back down. Again and again, their allies within the town tried to batter through the inner fortifications, their war cries mingling with the screams of the wounded. By the time the sun rose, the plain was a mire of churned soil and blood. In some sectors, the outer rampart had been overrun, and fighting spilled into the narrow no-man's land between the two lines. In others, the Romans had repelled the attackers, but only at the cost of exhaustion so profound that the legionaries could barely stand. It was in one of those critical gaps that Caesar committed his reserves, the German cavalry, held back until the decisive moment. With a blare of trumpets, they thundered out from behind the Roman lines and into the flanks of the Gaulish assault columns. The sudden impact broke the momentum, scattering warriors who had believed the ramparts were finally about to collapse. The Germans pressed the attack relentlessly, driving wedges into the Gaulish formations, cutting them apart before they could regroup. Seeing the tide shift, the Roman infantry rallied. Fresh cohorts were rotated forward to reclaim the sections of wall that had been lost in the night. Inside Alesia, the defenders felt the change even before they could see it. The horns grew distant, then fell silent altogether. The warriors on the inner rampart turned and looked back toward the plain, hoping for a sign that the outer assault was still pressing forward. But no signal came. No victory cries. Only the low drone of Roman trumpets calling their soldiers to reform. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the momentum drained away. The Gaulish attackers began to fall back, first in small knots, then in great confused masses. The men within Alesia watched from the walls as their last chance receded across the fields, leaving behind only the wounded and the dead. When the sun rose higher and the battlefield was revealed in full, it was clear to all that the siege had been decided. Yet even in that moment of Roman triumph, there was no cheer that rose from the ranks. Only the deep, ragged breathing of men who had spent every reserve of strength, standing amid a landscape of ruin. And for the Gauls, there was only the slow, inescapable realization that the gods had not intervened, that all the valor in the world could not undo the net Caesar had cast around Alesia. In the quiet that followed, as the survivors drifted back toward their camps, the siege at last came to its inevitable conclusion, the surrender of Vercingetorix. With the relief army shattered and no further hope of escape, the Gaulish leaders within Alesia faced the grim clarity of what remained. For days, no attack came from outside the walls. No signal fires flickered across the hills. The Romans resumed their patrols and repairs, as methodical as ever, their ranks replenished by the return of detached cohorts. Inside the fortress, the air grew stagnant. The food reserves, carefully rationed in the weeks before the final assault, were almost gone. The horses had long since been slaughtered, their hides boiled into a bitter broth. Children cried in the dark, their voices thin from hunger. Even the warriors, who once had bellowed defiantly from the parapets, fell silent as they watched the Roman pickets move like shadows around the vast enclosure. It is said that Vercingetorix called a council in what passed for the town's great hall, though by then it was little more than a battered shelter of rough-hewn timbers and the remnants of woven thatch. There, surrounded by the chieftains who had once dreamed of uniting all Gaul, he spoke in a low, measured voice. He did not rage or weep, nor did he pretend that any chance remained to break free. He simply described what would follow if they delayed surrender: the slow suffocation of their people, the dismantling of the town, the execution or enslavement of all who had followed him. Some accounts claim that he offered to take full responsibility, to sacrifice himself in hope that Caesar would spare the rest. Whether this was a genuine appeal or a final gesture of defiance, none can say for certain. But even the most stubborn chiefs found no words to object. In the end, there was no argument left to sustain. On the following day, the gates remained closed, but emissaries climbed down from the walls under a white banner. They were led blindfolded through the Roman lines to deliver the message. Vercingetorix would yield himself in exchange for the mercy of his people. Caesar, ever the tactician, made no promises he did not intend to keep. He agreed to spare the defenders from immediate slaughter, though he said nothing of their future enslavement. The Roman legions received the news with weary resignation rather than triumph. There was no need for more blood when the outcome was so complete. At dusk, the gates swung open. A long procession emerged, priests carrying sacred emblems, chieftains stripped of their weapons, and finally, the warriors, many too gaunt to stand without support. They moved in a hushed column, their footsteps muffled by the trampled soil. Then Vercingetorix appeared. He rode on a tall horse, though he looked no longer like the figure whose name had once stirred every tribe in Gaul. His cloak was ragged, stained by weeks of dust and smoke. Yet in that moment, high in the saddle, framed by the collapsing walls, he retained a bearing that none could deny. He guided the horse forward with a slow, deliberate pace, as if each step were a ritual. When he reached the space before Caesar's tribunal, he dismounted without a word. The silence was so complete that the distant crackle of Roman cook fires carried across the field. Some say he removed his armor piece by piece, laying it at Caesar's feet. Others claim he simply knelt, bowing his head, in acceptance. The sources differ on these details, and perhaps it does not matter. The essence of the moment was unchanged. Here knelt the last great hope of a free Gaul, yielding to the one man who had proved impossible to outmaneuver. Caesar watched without visible emotion. He did not raise Vercingetorix up, nor did he order his immediate execution. Instead, he signaled the guards, who stepped forward to take the captive away. In their wake, the exhausted Gaulish soldiers slumped to the ground, some pressing their faces to the earth as if they could not bear to look. The surrender was not a thunderclap of drama, but a quiet, inexorable end. No sudden violence, no unexpected reprieve, only the steady fulfillment of a campaign that had begun many months before, when Caesar first led his columns across the river into Gaul. In the days that followed, the Romans entered Alesia. They found stores of grain too meager to feed even a fraction of the defenders, walls undermined by desperate attempts at reinforcement, and streets littered with the debris of final resistance. For the survivors, there was no celebration, only the cold clarity that life as they had known it was over. Many were sold into slavery, dispersed across the Roman world as living trophies of Caesar's victory. Others were forced to swear allegiance to Rome, their lands parceled out as tribute. As for Vercingetorix, he would spend years in a Roman prison. When Caesar finally celebrated his grand triumph in Rome, the Gaulish king was led in chains through the streets, a spectacle for the cheering crowds. In the end, he was strangled, as tradition dictated, in the bowels of the Tullianum, yet his memory never entirely faded. Long after the fires of Alesia cooled to ash, the story of the last stand, of a man who dared to unite his people against the encroaching empire, continued to echo through the valleys and forests of Gaul. And if you listen carefully to those ancient stones, you might still hear the echo of hoofbeats, the murmured counsel in a smoky hall, and the quiet resolve of a people who refused to surrender until every possibility was spent. The triumph of Caesar, after Alesia had fallen, and the last embers of Gaulish resistance smoldered into resignation, Caesar faced the delicate task of transforming conquest into control. The legions, exhausted but intact, withdrew from the ruined fortifications that circled the hilltop. They dismantled the wooden walls plank by plank, stacked the timbers into orderly piles, and buried the spent weapons in long trenches that would serve as silent witnesses to what had unfolded. Throughout the autumn, dispatches sped along Roman roads, announcing to the Senate that the war in Gaul, so costly in blood and coin, was now effectively over. The Senate received these reports with a mixture of relief and suspicion. For all the territory he had claimed, Caesar's growing fame troubled those who feared a general more ambitious than loyal. In the meantime, the legions moved steadily from one subdued settlement to the next, collecting hostages, imposing tribute, and garrisoning outposts to prevent any spark of renewed defiance. Some tribes surrendered at once, eager to avoid the fate they had witnessed at Alesia. Others retreated into the remote forests, hoping winter would shield them. But the Roman detachments, seasoned by years of pursuit, rarely allowed them peace for long. When Caesar finally returned to Cisalpine Gaul to spend the winter, he carried with him more than the spoils of victory. He possessed something far more potent: the legend of a commander who had subdued an entire nation with patient, implacable will. This legend would become the cornerstone of his political future. Word spread quickly through the provinces that Vercingetorix still lived, held in a Roman cell as a living symbol of Caesar's triumph. Some whispered that the Gallic king might yet be ransomed. Others believed that his life was preserved only to adorn Caesar's triumphal procession in Rome. In either case, the message was the same: all those who resisted the Republic would eventually be humbled. During that winter, Caesar occupied himself not only with the administration of the new provinces, but with the composition of his commentaries. He dictated the record of the campaigns with the same dispassionate precision he had once used to deploy his legions. In each carefully measured sentence, he presented the conquest as inevitable, a logical consequence of Roman resolve and Gallic disunity. Even so, for those who had marched with him, the memory of Alesia was less clinical. Veterans recalled the choking dust that rose when thousands of desperate warriors charged their ramparts. They remembered the lean faces of the defenders who emerged from the gates in surrender. Some admitted that, even after so many years of warfare, they had never seen a siege so vast and relentless. By the spring, preparations began in earnest for Caesar's return to Rome. He knew that the triumph he intended to celebrate would be more than a display of military success. It would be a declaration of his supremacy over any rivals still hoping to limit his power. At dawn on the appointed day, the processions assembled. Trumpeters lifted their instruments, and the first notes of the triumphal fanfare drifted through the crowded avenues. Lictors in scarlet cloaks parted the sea of onlookers, clearing the way for the long train of spoils and captives. It began with carts heaped high with Gallic weapons, the long iron swords, the tall oval shields, the captured standards of countless tribes. Behind them came wagons laden with treasures, gold torques and brooches, carved drinking horns, and the tribute seized from towns that had hoped to buy their safety. Next marched the prisoners, fettered at wrists and ankles. They moved with lowered eyes, their hair grown long and tangled in captivity. The Roman crowd leaned in to gape at them, to marvel at these barbarians who had once seemed so fierce. Then came Vercingetorix. They had dressed him in his native finery, as if to heighten the contrast between the proud chieftain he had been and the captive he had become. His face betrayed little emotion as he passed beneath the triumphal arches. Whether he felt shame, defiance, or simple resignation No observer could say. For the watching multitude, his presence confirmed everything the triumph intended, that no enemy, however valiant, could withstand the destiny of Rome. At last, the chariot appeared, drawn by 4 white horses. Caesar stood upon it, clad in a robe of purple and gold, crowned with a laurel wreath. Cheers erupted as he raised his arm in acknowledgement. Around him swirled the incense smoke, the clamor of horns, the cascade of petals drifting from balconies. He made no effort to disguise his satisfaction. This tournament, after so many campaigns, so many rivalries, was the culmination of all his ambitions. Behind him, the legions marched in disciplined columns, their armor polished to a blinding sheen. They chanted the names of the battles they had won, each syllable ringing against the marble facades of the city. As evening fell, the parade wound its way to the Capitoline Hill. Ritual demanded that the great enemy, whose defeat sanctified the triumph, should die at the conclusion of the rites. Vercingetorix was led away into the darkness of the Tullianum. There, in the chill subterranean chamber, he was strangled according to ancient custom. His death passed almost unnoticed by the revelers who filled the streets, drunk on victory and spectacle. Yet long after the last torch was extinguished, after the music faded and the petals were swept from the paving stones, the memory of the man who had dared to unite Gaul remained. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the city grew still, it was easy to imagine that the spirit of Vercingetorix still walked among the colonnades, silent, implacable, reminding Rome that even the greatest triumphs are never without their shadows. And so, the story settled into the collective memory, a tale of conquest, ceremony, and the quiet extinguishing of a final, stubborn hope, the shadow of conquest. When the last echoes of Caesar's triumph had drifted into memory, the city of Rome resumed its habitual rhythm. Market stalls opening before dawn, senators hurrying to their deliberations, legionaries polishing their armor in anticipation of further campaigns. Yet beneath the proud veneer of Roman order, the conquest of Gaul continued to cast its long shadow. The provinces that Caesar had subdued were not merely geographic prizes. They were living lands filled with survivors whose grief and resentment could not be erased by a single parade. Across the broad plains and the dark, mossy forests, families mourned sons who had fallen at Alesia or perished during the winter sieges. In the villages along the Loire and the Saône, elders told quiet stories of how the Gauls had once stood united under a single leader, if only for a season. Children grew up hearing those stories, wondering whether someday the tribes would rise again. Meanwhile, the Roman administration moved quickly to formalize the new reality. Garrisons were established at key crossroads. Veteran soldiers received parcels of confiscated farmland as rewards, planting vineyards where Gallic fortresses had stood. Tax collectors arrived with ledgers and scales, translating conquest into revenue. In the cities nearest the frontier, Roman merchants set up their stalls, offering glassware, amphorae of oil, and bright bolts of dyed cloth to a people who had never known such trade. Some Gauls embraced these novelties eagerly, seeing in Roman goods a path to prosperity. Others regarded them as further evidence that their world was slipping away. The roads themselves became arteries of assimilation. Along them moved not only caravans of supplies, but also ideas and customs. Latin inscriptions appeared on public buildings. Roman magistrates issued decrees that redefined property, inheritance, and civic duty. Over time, the native tongue gave way to the language of the conquerors, until even the descendants of the warriors who had defied Caesar spoke Latin in their homes. And yet, traces of the old spirit endured in curious ways. At rural shrines, Gauls continued to leave offerings to their ancient gods: oak leaves, clay figurines, coins marked with symbols no Roman official could decipher. In the privacy of their hearths, they recited prayers that had been whispered since before the legions ever came. In Rome itself, the victory became a foundation for Caesar's unmatched prestige. His supporters proclaimed that he had brought order to a wild and dangerous land. They spoke admiringly of his clarity of purpose, his genius for strategy, his tolerance in victory. But among his rivals, the fear that had long smoldered grew more urgent. For if Caesar could conquer a continent and return as a living legend, what power could possibly restrain him within the walls of the Republic? These doubts and resentments would gather force, like a summer storm brewing beyond the horizon. They would find their shape in political intrigues, in whispered alliances, in the desperate calculations of senators who feared they might one day share the fate of Vercingetorix. Yet for a time, all of this lay hidden beneath the surface. On the official record, Gaul was pacified, the Republic secure, the legions triumphant. As the years advanced, statues were erected in Caesar's honor, marble likenesses that fixed his features in expressions of serene command. In the Forum, passers-by paused to study the carvings, to trace with their eyes the folds of the general's robe, the laurel at his brow. They could not know how soon those statues would become monuments not merely to conquest, but to an age on the brink of transformation. Still, when dusk settled over the city, and the lamps were lit along the porticos, the mood often softened. Some Romans liked to stroll through the colonnades, to look upon the symbols of their triumphs. They would remember how the legions had encircled the hill at Alesia, how the Gallic king had been led away in chains, how the empire itself seemed to expand with every step Caesar took. And sometimes, if the night was quiet enough, they might imagine that across the wind-swept fields of Gaul, the last embers of defiance still glowed in the darkness, waiting for the moment when memory would once more give rise to courage. That, too, was part of the legacy, the unspoken truth that no conquest ever ends completely. There is always something left behind, a yearning, a story, a shadow that refuses to fade. The road to the Ides. In the years that followed Caesar's return from Gaul, the rhythms of Roman politics took on an anxious, unsettled cadence, though the Republic still called itself a republic. Every senator, every magistrate, every citizen who paid attention could feel that something irrevocable had shifted. Caesar had become consul again, then dictator for set terms, and eventually dictator for life. The old forms remained: elections, debates, decrees. But their substance was hollowed out, like the shell of a temple long abandoned by its gods. For the common people, Caesar's rule often appeared benevolent. He passed laws to relieve debt, settled veterans in new colonies, and staged spectacles so dazzling that for a moment the crowd might forget how fragile their institutions had become. But in the Senate, suspicion deepened. Men who once sat beside Caesar in council began to see in his every gesture a quiet threat. When he entered the chamber, they noted how the lictors carried the fasces before him, how the crowd parted as if before a king. Some whispered that Caesar had grown careless with power, blind to the caution that had once guided him. He accepted honors that no Roman before him had dared to claim. Statues among the gods, a golden chair in the theater, a perpetual dictatorship. And in private, a question took root in the minds of men who had devoted their lives to the Senate's dignity. If Caesar had the will to conquer Gaul, what might restrain him from dissolving the Republic altogether? Meanwhile, Caesar himself moved through the city with an air of calm certainty. Each morning he rose before dawn, heard petitions, signed decrees, and received embassies. He appeared everywhere, at the Forum, the temples, the games, Yet he remained elusive, as if some part of him still lingered in the forests of Gaul, beyond the reach of his enemies. On certain evenings, he walked alone in his gardens, beneath the olive trees, whose trunks were older than any living senator. Some said he was haunted by the memory of Pompey, whose death in Egypt had removed the last rival who might have balanced his ambition. Others believed he foresaw his end approaching, though he would never admit it aloud. Among the conspirators, the plan took shape slowly, in cautious meetings behind locked doors. There were no oaths sworn over sacrificial beasts, no solemn proclamations, only the steady accumulation of fear and resolve. One senator argued that they must strike before Caesar departed for Parthia. If he left Rome at the head of his legions, he might never return as a citizen among equals. Another insisted they wait for a moment when the people could be convinced it was not murder, but liberation. And so the circle widened. More names whispered in confidence, more hands pledged to a cause no one dared describe openly. They watched Caesar from the shadows, counting his steps, noting the hours when he walked without guards. On the night before the Ides of March, many of the conspirators lay awake in their homes, listening to the wind rustle the shutters, their thoughts returning again and again to the question they could not escape. Could Rome survive the loss of Caesar? Could it survive his triumph? In the darkness, their resolve hardened. They believed they were about to perform an act that would redeem the Republic, cleanse it of tyranny, and restore the ancient virtues. Yet even in their certainty, a faint unease lingered. For no matter how they framed it, as sacrifice, as necessity, it was still the taking of a life that had become woven into Rome's destiny. Outside, the city lay in a hush, unaware that by the following night, the streets would be crowded with rumors and the air thick with the scent of blood. Soon, dawn would come, pale and unremarkable, illuminating the porticos and colonnades where senators would gather in their togas. No herald would announce what waited behind the Senate's doors. No augur would foretell the shape of the day. But in the hearts of the conspirators, the hour was already fixed, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. And as Caesar himself prepared to rise from his bed and dress in the garments of office, he could not know that the last chapter of his story was about to unfold. Wordless, merciless, and unforgettable. If you listen closely, you might almost hear the hush before the blow falls, the moment when history draws in its breath, just before it changes everything. The Ides of March. It was early morning on the Ides of March when Caesar rose from his bed. A pale light crept between the curtains, spilling across the mosaics that depicted his victories. Outside, the city was stirring in its familiar rhythm. Vendors setting out baskets of olives, clients hurrying to present petitions, children chasing each other across the paving stones. He dressed in his senatorial toga, the garment heavy with purple edging that proclaimed his extraordinary rank. As he prepared, his wife Calpurnia lingered nearby, her face drawn with worry. She had dreamed of the house collapsing, of Caesar bleeding in her arms. She pleaded with him to stay home, just for this day. For a moment he hesitated. Perhaps it was the vividness of her dream, or the oppressive stillness in the air that made her words seem less like superstition and more like an omen. Yet soon, Decimus Brutus arrived, offering a gentle reassurance that the Senate awaited, that postponing the session would disappoint the senators and suggest weakness. With a few soft words, Decimus pulled Caesar back onto his appointed path. So Caesar stepped into the morning, down the broad steps of his house, through streets that knew his triumphs and his excesses, oblivious to the fate he was carrying with him, like a hidden blade. The walk to Pompey's theater was unremarkable. Citizens watched him pass, bowing their heads in respect. The lictors in their red sashes cleared a path. No one called out a warning. No one blocked his progress. It was a day that looked like any other. The Senate meeting had been moved to Pompey's theater because the Curia was under repair. The choice of location was, perhaps, an irony none could have foreseen. Pompey, whom Caesar had defeated, lending his name to the place where Caesar's life would end. Inside, the senators gathered in small knots of conversation. Some were pale, avoiding each other's eyes. Others pretended a casual interest in the day's agenda. A few glanced again and again toward the entrance, as if unable to keep from counting the minutes. When Caesar entered, the assembly rose as one. He moved among them with an ease born of long habit, accepting greetings, acknowledging petitions, never suspecting how many of those hands were already pledged against him. As he took his seat, a senator approached with a petition, Metellus Cimber, whose brother had been exiled. He pressed the document into Caesar's hand, begging clemency. When Caesar refused, Metellus clutched his toga, pulling it down from his shoulders. It was the signal. In that instant, history pivoted on a blade. Casca struck first, his dagger glancing off Caesar's neck. Caesar turned, incredulous, and caught Casca's arm, crying out that this was violence. Then, as more hands joined the attack, the reality came clear. This was no plea, no protest. This was an execution. Blow after blow fell. In the chaos, Caesar tried to rise, only to be driven back by the press of bodies. Blood splattered the marble floor. The senators' faces blurred together in a mask of fear, resolve, and something almost like grief. At last, when he saw Brutus among them, Brutus whom he had trusted, perhaps even loved as a son, he ceased to struggle. Some said he spoke words of reproach. "You too, child." Others claimed he covered his face with his toga, unwilling to meet the eyes of those who ended him. In moments, it was finished. The senators stumbled away, their daggers slick, their hearts hammering as if they had survived a storm. No cheers rose. No declaration rang out. There was only the ragged sound of breathing and the slow spreading of blood across the floor tiles. Outside, Rome waited, still unaware. In a few hours, word would race through the streets, and the people would gather, not knowing whether to grieve or celebrate. For now, the only witnesses were the silent statues of Pompey, the cold colonnades, and the men who had convinced themselves they were saving a republic. Yet even in that chamber of violence, there was a hush that felt almost sacred, as if all of Rome was holding its breath. History, in that moment, was no longer merely a record of events. It had become something closer to a dream, inevitable, implacable, and sorrowful beyond any telling. And somewhere in the corridors beyond, the dawn continued to brighten, indifferent to the passing of the man who had once thought himself eternal. If you listen long enough to the echoes of that day, you may still hear the quiet steps retreating, the blade slipping into folds of cloth, and the last whisper of Caesar's life leaving the world that could not contain him. The city after the fall. In the hours that followed Caesar's death, the city of Rome drifted into an uneasy stillness, as though every stone had absorbed the shock. Word traveled by whispers at first, hesitant and disbelieving. Julius Caesar was dead, killed not by foreign enemies, but by the very men who had once called him friend. Outside Pompey's theater, citizens began to gather, drawn by a dull curiosity and the thrill of rumor. They peered through the colonnades, trying to glimpse the scene within, but the assassins had already slipped away, some vanishing into alleys, others hurrying toward their estates beyond the Tiber. The Senate was deserted, the body left behind on the marble floor, a testament to what ambition could achieve and what it could cost. When servants finally carried Caesar's corpse home, a hush rippled through the crowd. Some covered their faces, shamed to look upon the ruin of their leader. Others simply stared, transfixed by the sight of greatness reduced to something so small and still. The lictors, whose duty it had been to protect him, walked in silence, their faces lowered, as though even the symbols of power no longer held any purpose. At Calpurnia's house, the body was laid upon a low couch, the blood congealing on his garments. Calpurnia wept in private. She had dreamed of this ending, yet dreaming had done nothing to prevent it. No prophecy, no pleading had been enough to halt the tide. All across Rome, people began to debate in murmurs whether this was a liberation or a calamity. Shopkeepers wondered if there would be riots. Soldiers questioned whom they should obey. Senators locked their doors, fearing vengeance from the plebeians. The air itself seemed to vibrate with uncertainty, as though Rome could not decide whether to mourn or to rejoice. Meanwhile, Mark Antony, who had not been among the conspirators, was plotting how best to turn this chaos to his advantage. He understood that power seldom remained unclaimed for long, and in Caesar's death, he sensed the opportunity to inherit not just authority, but the devotion of a city that still clung to the idea of a single guiding hand. When the time came to present the body for the funeral, the forum filled with thousands. They pressed shoulder to shoulder, craning for a glimpse of Caesar's funeral bier, garlanded in laurel and draped in the deep purple of triumph. Some wept openly, struck by the memory of the feasts and games he had given, the coin he had distributed, the victories he had proclaimed in their names. Antony, standing before them, read aloud Caesar's will. His voice, usually smooth and measured, rang with a practiced sorrow as he announced that every citizen would receive a gift of money. A murmur rose, a tide of gratitude and guilt, mingled with rage at the men who had claimed to act in the name of liberty. Antony let the scroll fall silent for a moment, then gestured to the body. They say it was the sight of the wounds that turned the crowd. The red gashes, still stark against the pale flesh, made the abstract idea of restoring the Republic seem trivial compared to the reality of betrayal. One by one, voices rose, cursing the conspirators. Some wept. Others shouted that Caesar's spirit would haunt the city until justice was done. Soon, the funeral pyre blazed. Flames climbed the wooden platform, and the heat drove the crowd backward in a swelling tide. Yet no one turned away. They watched until the last flicker died, until the body had become a memory they would carry like a hidden ember. Afterward, some took burning brands from the pyre and ran through the streets, setting fires at the doors of the assassins. In that night of confusion, the old order began to crumble. The Senate, once so confident in its righteousness, retreated behind guarded walls. The city seemed to drift in a kind of fever, waiting for someone to claim the vacant throne. If you were to walk the streets then, you might have felt how fragile all the laws and customs had become. Rome, the eternal city, was in truth only a gathering of men and fears, of pride and longing. And in the space left by Caesar's passing, 100 ambitions took root. From the rooftops, the smoke from the funeral pyre curled into the darkness, mingling with the night air. It smelled of cedar and flesh, and something harder to name, an ending that was also a beginning. And somewhere in that hush, a whisper spread. Caesar was gone, but the idea of him had not perished. It was alive in every heart that still beat faster at his memory, in every hand that clutched a coin stamped with his profile, in every mind already wondering what vengeance might look like. Even in death, he had not relinquished his hold upon them. And if you listened carefully, you might have heard the soft footfalls of destiny, moving closer, ready to claim the city he left behind. The rising storm. In the days after the funeral, the city of Rome felt like a vessel straining at the seams. Though the conspirators insisted they had restored the Republic, no sense of triumph lingered in the streets. Instead, there was a charged stillness, like the hush before a summer thunderstorm breaks over the fields. Mark Antony wasted no time. He summoned the Senate and spoke with the smooth composure of a man who understood precisely how fear could be transformed into power. Standing among the marble columns, he reminded them that Caesar had been declared a god in life, that the people adored him still, that the legions would never forgive this murder. His words were soft, measured, each syllable a quiet threat. No shouts, no overt demands, only the steady drip of inevitability, wearing away their confidence. Some senators listened in stony silence, refusing to betray their unease. Others shifted in their seats, glancing at one another as though to confirm they were not alone in their apprehension. In the shadows of the Curia, news of Antony's intentions spread. He meant to seize the moment, to claim the loyalty of Caesar's veterans, to stir the plebeians to fury if the Senate dared to oppose him. Meanwhile, the conspirators retreated behind locked doors, issuing proclamations that spoke of liberty and the restoration of old virtues. But the words fell flat. For too many Romans, liberty was an abstraction, while the memory of Caesar's generosity was tangible as a coin in the palm. He had fed them, entertained them, led them to victory. Now his assassins offered only sermons. At the same time, another figure began to stir in the provinces. Gaius Octavius, known to most as Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son. Barely 19. He had been studying in Illyricum when the news reached him. Those who knew him expected little. He was sickly, quiet, overshadowed by the giant whose name he bore. But Octavian proved to be made of a different metal than anyone guessed. With a calm determination that would one day become legend, he began gathering supporters, writing letters to influential allies, reminding them of the inheritance Caesar had left him, not merely in coin, but in claim to authority. As spring ripened into summer, Rome became a city of rumors. Every tavern hummed with speculation. Some whispered that Antony and Octavian would surely clash. Others insisted the Senate would rally its own armies to defend the Republic. And still others, the most weary and practical, shrugged and said that power would go wherever the soldiers pointed their swords. Meanwhile, in the Forum, the statue of Caesar remained draped in wreaths and ribbons. Each morning, fresh flowers appeared at its base. In the evenings, candles glowed in little constellations, left by hands too timid to be seen in daylight. It was as if the city itself refused to let go of his memory, cradling it like an ember that refused to die. Antony, watching this devotion, understood he need only wait. Grief and outrage were fertile soil. He spoke to the veterans in quiet meetings, reminding them of Caesar's promises, land, pensions, honor, and hinted that the Senate would surely forget these obligations now that their benefactor was gone. He visited the plebeians, promising stability and respect. Every word was chosen to reinforce the same idea, that only he could protect what Caesar had built. But even Antony did not anticipate how quickly Octavian would move. In the countryside, the young heir wrote letters in his own hand, pledging to avenge his adoptive father, to reward those who joined him. Men who had once scoffed at his youth began to reconsider. Perhaps he was weak, or perhaps he was simply biding his time, gathering strength beneath the placid surface. By late summer, it became clear that a reckoning was approaching. The conspirators, once so certain their daggers had saved Rome, now realized they had merely cracked open the shell of an old order. And from that fracture, something new was crawling out. Something no blade could easily destroy. If you had walked the streets on those hot evenings, you might have felt it yourself. That slow coiling of destiny. No proclamations yet. No banners or horns. Only the subtle rearrangement of loyalties. The quiet confessions exchanged in lamp-lit doorways. The soft scrape of armor being prepared. Soon, there would be no middle ground left to stand upon. Each citizen would have to decide whether they belonged to the dream of the Republic or to the memory of Caesar. And in the hearts of many, that memory was already moral than any Senate decree. Some nights, when the city finally slept, you could imagine Caesar himself standing in the darkness, watching with that familiar, faint smile. As if he knew that, in trying to erase him, his enemies had only ensured his spirit would be woven more deeply into every corner of Rome. And when the storm finally broke, no one could pretend they had not seen the first gathering clouds, the ascent of Octavian. By the time autumn winds began to swirl through the narrow Roman alleys, Octavian was no longer a distant curiosity. His name spread like a murmur at first, soft, speculative, almost dismissive. But soon the murmur grew into something heavier, a sense of inevitability no one could ignore. He returned to Italy quietly, almost humbly, stepping ashore with only a modest retinue. No triumphal parade, no extravagant gestures. Those who came to see the youth expecting to find a callow boy were unsettled by the calm clarity of his demeanor. He looked thin, even fragile, but his eyes were steady, and his voice carried the unshakable conviction of someone who believed destiny had chosen him. He did not insult the Senate, nor did he openly challenge Antony. Instead, he presented himself as the faithful son, intent only on honoring Caesar's wishes and defending his legacy. Letters were sent to veterans reminding them of Caesar's testament, generous grants of land and money, still unpaid. To the common people, Octavian spoke of duty and continuity, of the gratitude owed to the man who had brought Rome peace and prosperity. Each message was wrapped in language so polite, so deferential, that it disarmed suspicion. Yet every polite word concealed a blade. If the Senate failed to honor Caesar's bequests, they branded themselves as traitors to the memory of a father who had fed and clothed the masses. If Antony claimed to be Caesar's true heir, he would have to explain why the young man bearing Caesar's adopted name was offering what Antony could not. While Antony held the advantage of power in Rome, Octavian proved masterful in the provinces. He traveled among the veteran colonies, shaking hands, listening to grievances, promising that the promises Caesar made would not be allowed to fade into nothing. It was a performance of modesty, but beneath it lay a canny instinct for leverage. In the Senate, some had hoped the two men would neutralize each other, that ambition would devour them both. Instead, they watched with dawning unease as Octavian's stature grew. Where Antony threatened and cajoled, Octavian soothed and reassured. Each day that passed, more veterans pledged loyalty. Each day, more senators reconsidered whether it was safe to treat this young man as a mere child. Meanwhile, Octavian's mother, Atia, moved quietly behind the scenes, meeting with influential matrons whose husbands controlled fortunes and votes. Even Livia Drusilla, who would one day become his empress, began to hear whispers of the young heir's resolve. The women of Rome, often underestimated, became the silent conduits through which Octavian's reputation flowed, softening suspicion, spreading curiosity, preparing the ground. Mark Antony, sensing the danger, grew less patient. He organized spectacles to keep the crowds entertained, reminding them he was Caesar's most loyal lieutenant. Gladiatorial games, public feasts, rations of grain. It was all calculated to make the plebeians forget that another claimant had returned. Yet it never quite erased the delicate web Octavian was spinning. At the same time, in the quiet chambers of the Senate, orators tried to shape public sentiment. Some insisted that Caesar's death was the dawn of freedom. Others hinted that perhaps the Republic's restoration was already a fiction. The mood was one of exhausted uncertainty. Rome had seen so many promises, so many reforms, so many men who declared themselves saviors. All that remained was a creeping sense that no matter who won, peace would be elusive. By winter, alliances shifted in earnest. Antony, frustrated, began to speak of Octavian with open disdain. But contempt was dangerous fuel. Every insult drove Octavian's supporters closer to fanaticism. Every public slight strengthened the sense that this quiet youth was a necessary balance to Antony's arrogance. Then came the moment when Octavian made his intentions unmistakable. He offered to pay the veterans from his own purse. The gesture was breathtaking, an act of sacrifice so theatrical it could not be ignored. The Senate, desperate to prevent a total collapse of order, reluctantly agreed to grant him legal recognition as Caesar's heir. It was a triumph carefully disguised as a duty. Octavian did not gloat. He simply accepted the Senate's decrees with solemn gratitude, as if he had never sought power at all. But in private, his advisors understood what had been accomplished. The first threshold had been crossed. He was no longer merely the boy with Caesar's name. He was now the man whose claim was ratified by law and by sentiment alike. In the taverns, the veterans clinked their cups and muttered that perhaps this Octavian would restore order at last. In the Senate, old men weighed the risks of continued resistance. And Antony, who had once seemed unassailable, began to taste the first bitter draft of rivalry. If you wandered Rome's colonnades in those cold nights, you would have felt the change in the air. The Republic was not yet dead, but it was fading, like a lamp sputtering in a draft. In its place, something new was gathering strength, a promise of stability, clothed in the gentle, inexorable ambition of a 19-year-old who refused to be overlooked. And so the city held its breath, waiting to see how long the illusion of peace could endure before the swords emerged again from their sheaths. The shadow of civil war. The first months of the new year brought neither clarity nor reconciliation. Rome existed in a hush that was not quite peace, a tense suspension in which no one dared to move too quickly, lest the illusion shatter. Yet beneath the stillness, the old rivalries continued to ferment. Octavian and Antony had become the twin centers of gravity around which every ambition, every fear, every whisper revolved. The Senate tried to maintain the fiction that the Republic remained whole, that its laws still governed men's actions. But in the streets, among the soldiers and the shopkeepers and the clerks, it was clear that nothing would ever return to what it had been. Antony, restless and wary, began to gather more troops. He had never been a man of subtlety. Where Octavian offered quiet pledges and polite assurances, Antony relied on spectacle, loyalty purchased with treasure, and the raw magnetism of his battlefield record. But even he could not ignore the silent erosion of his prestige. For every cohort he recruited, Octavian found another group of veterans willing to swear allegiance to Caesar's chosen son. Some nights, torchlight processions wound through the forum, Antony's supporters chanting slogans, waving standards, reminding the people who had commanded Caesar's legions. Other nights, Octavian's messengers distributed food and coins to the same crowds, reminding them who had pledged to fulfill Caesar's last will. It was a contest fought not only with swords but with symbols, each gesture calculated to outmaneuver the other. In the midst of this rivalry, the Senate watched with growing dread. Cicero, ever the opportunist, perceived that Octavian's youth could be turned to advantage. If Antony was the brute who threatened liberty, perhaps Octavian could be the instrument to bring him low. And so, with careful rhetoric, Cicero began to weave the narrative that Octavian was not a tyrant in waiting, but a necessary ally in defense of the Republic. It was a convenient delusion. one that Cicero himself half believed in moments of desperation. For all his eloquence, he could not see that he was inviting the end of the very order he claimed to protect. Yet the Senate had no better options. Faced with Antony's defiance, they placed their hopes in a youth whose ambition was as cold and methodical as any conqueror's. Meanwhile, the Italian countryside began to fill with armed men. Farmers who had once served under Caesar were summoned to muster again, drawn by promises of land and debt forgiveness. Old wounds reopened as neighbors found themselves on opposite sides of the gathering conflict. Along the Via Appia, small skirmishes erupted between rival patrols, each side testing the other's resolve. Octavian, ever cautious, moved with the deliberation of someone who understood that legitimacy was as important as victory. He refused to declare open war. Instead, he framed every action as a defensive measure, protection of the Republic, fulfillment of Caesar's legacy, resistance to Antony's overreach. Yet behind the legal language, the preparations were unmistakable. Fortifications were repaired. Supply lines were established. Trusted lieutenants were dispatched to secure key towns. For the ordinary citizens of Rome, the tension became a dull ache. Markets remained open, but traders spoke in hushed tones. Temples continued their rituals, but the gods seemed indifferent. Even the festivals felt muted, as though the city itself had grown too weary to celebrate. In private villas along the Tiber, senators debated what would happen when the illusion of peace finally broke. Some argued that Antony must be appeased. Others insisted that Octavian's claim could not be denied. Still others prayed that somehow, impossibly, the two men would find common purpose. But in their hearts, most knew that reconciliation was a fantasy. Rome had tasted too much blood, and the thirst for dominance could not be quenched by compromise. Late in the winter, as cold rain swept across the Seven Hills, reports reached the capital that Antony had begun a march northward, intent on seizing Cisalpine Gaul from Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's assassins. It was a reckless gamble, proof that Antony meant to crush his enemies by force rather than by persuasion. The Senate had to respond. Cicero rose to deliver his most blistering orations, denouncing Antony as an enemy of the state. Decrees were passed declaring Antony an outlaw. And with a sense of inevitability that felt almost like relief, Octavian was granted imperium, the legal authority to command troops. In that moment, the final veil was torn away. Octavian had become not merely Caesar's heir in name, but in power. He was now free to wage war under the Republic's banner, to pursue Antony with all the legitimacy of Senate approval. Yet as he prepared to march, there was no triumph in his demeanor, no exultation, only the same measured calm that had always defined him. The certainty that this was but another step in a destiny unfolding exactly as it must. And so the stage was set. Two men, both claiming to speak for Caesar's memory, one driven by the force of his charisma and the blunt certainty of his will, the other guided by the quiet, unyielding conviction that Rome could belong to no one else. In the gathering dusk, the city listened for the tramp of legions in the distance, each footstep a reminder that the peace they pretended to cherish had already died, and only the final reckoning remained. The long road to Actium. The years that followed unfolded with a slow, inexorable certainty, like a tide that could not be held back by any decree or prayer. The war between Antony and Octavian moved through phases of confrontation and uneasy reconciliation, each episode more corrosive to the old institutions that still pretended to guide Rome's destiny. After Antony's failed attempt to seize Cisalpine Gaul, he was forced into retreat, negotiating a temporary truce at Brundisium. For a brief moment, The Republic seemed to have rescued itself from outright civil war. The two rivals divided the known world between them. Octavian commanding the west, Antony ruling the east. Lepidus left with Africa as a consolation prize that fooled no one into believing he was an equal partner. It was a settlement born of exhaustion rather than goodwill. Behind every handshake and public proclamation of unity, both men watched each other with cold calculation. They understood that such an arrangement could never endure, not while both lived and both claimed to be Caesar's true successor. In the east, Antony found a stage grand enough for his appetites and ambitions. He established his court in Tarsus and then in Alexandria, where the Egyptian queen, Cleopatra, waited with all the seductive power and ancient prestige of her dynasty. Their union was a confluence of need and desire. Antony longing for resources to sustain his campaigns, Cleopatra seeking protection for her throne and a place in Rome's designs. Stories spread back to Italy, whispered by merchants and embassies, of Antony arrayed in foreign silks, of feasts that blurred the line between ceremony and intoxication, of coins struck with his likeness beside Cleopatra's. To many in Rome, these tales were proof that he had surrendered to decadence, that he was no longer a Roman in anything but name. Octavian knew the power of such rumors. He understood that the battle would be won as much by perception as by arms. In the quiet chambers of his residence, he and his advisors crafted a narrative, one that painted Antony as a traitor enthralled by an Eastern queen, a man willing to divide Roman power to serve his own pleasures. While Antony waged campaigns in Parthia and later returned to Alexandria to rebuild his forces, Octavian tightened his hold on the West. Slowly, methodically, he took command of the legions, rewarded loyal officers, and extended his patronage over cities that had once wavered in their allegiance. He also knew when to display a carefully measured clemency. Former enemies were welcomed back into the fold, provided they would renounce Antony. Land was redistributed to veterans, public works were funded, and the people were reminded, quietly but insistently, that stability lay with Octavian alone. Even so, the equilibrium could not last. The final rupture came when Antony formally recognized Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, as the legitimate heir of Julius Caesar. To Octavian, this was an unpardonable challenge. It threatened to nullify his entire claim to succession. More importantly, it offered a symbol around which Antony's supporters could rally. In the Senate, Octavian's partisans read aloud Antony's so-called donations of Alexandria, in which territories of the Roman East were granted to Cleopatra and her children. Senators gasped, whether in true outrage or practiced performance. It did not matter. The effect was precisely what Octavian intended: to depict Antony as a man who had betrayed Rome to a foreign dynasty. Soon, decrees were passed stripping Antony of his offices. War was declared not against Antony personally. Such a step might have seemed too openly fratricidal, but against Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, the dangerous enchantress corrupting Rome's finest general. This polite fiction allowed the Senate to preserve a shred of dignity while authorizing Octavian to lead the campaign, and so preparations began for the final confrontation. Legions assembled along the Adriatic coast. Shipwrights labored day and night to build a fleet strong enough to challenge Antony's navy, commanded by the formidable Admiral Agrippa. Messengers flew between Rome and the provinces, summoning every available resource to the cause. Antony, in turn, gathered his allies in the east. He and Cleopatra arrayed their ships at Actium, a barren promontory whose name would soon be etched into the annals of history. They believed their combined armada could break Octavian's naval blockade and seize the initiative. Yet as the months passed, their position grew tenuous. Supplies dwindled, morale faltered. Desertions increased as soldiers realized that Octavian held the advantage not only in men and provisions, but in the hearts of the Italian people. The final engagement came on a morning suffused with the smell of salt and tar. The two fleets faced each other across a glassy sea, the wind rising and falling as though reluctant to disturb the balance. On Octavian's flagship, Agrippa prepared his squadrons with disciplined patience. On Antony's deck, the mood was tense, an awareness that this battle would decide more than any campaign before. When the fighting began, it was chaos. Oars splintering, firepots shattering against hulls, cries lost in the roar of flame, and the crash of rams driving through timbers. From the shore, Octavian watched with the same steady composure that had carried him through every turning point of his rise. At the height of the melee, Cleopatra's ship slipped out of the line and fled toward the open sea. Whether it was a prearranged signal or a moment of panic, no one could say. Antony, seeing her sails vanish over the horizon, broke away to follow. In that instant, the cohesion of his fleet dissolved. As the remnants of Antony's navy surrendered or burned, Octavian did not exult. His expression remained unchanged, as though he had always known this was how it must end. The last embers of opposition flickered and died. The civil wars that had begun with Caesar's assassination had reached their final hour. What remained was not a republic restored, but a single will triumphant, and in the hush that followed, Rome prepared to bow before its new master, while Octavian, soon to be Augustus, looked out over the waves and felt the quiet satisfaction of a destiny fulfilled.